Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give just a minute as people join the webinar. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is our first webinar in a series that we're calling Nothing About Us Without Us. And our focus is centering the lived experiences of people with disabilities. We have a lot to share today, so I'm not going to overdo it in any way on the why behind this. I think that our title speaks volumes about the need that we have in our system for making sure that we're making decisions, that we're making those decisions inclusive of the people that are going to be affected by those decisions. Those of us that have been in education for some time and those that are new to the field, you know that you encounter regularly situations where very well-meaning, educated, committed people sit around a table making decisions about a group or a population that's not at the table. And our hope here is to really center those voices and hope that we are able to all take away some key learning. Let me advance my slide. For those of you that may need ASL interpretation, please note the directions that are here on the slide. ASL interpretation is available for this meeting, and in just a minute, you should see the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you go and click on that, you will see a next place where you can select ASL, and that will make sure that you have the interpretation you need. Today's webinar is focused on the built environment. So for you, those of you that may not use that term, we're really talking about our facilities, our buildings, access to buildings. I think it includes transportation, really those things that in a lot of ways we have a ton of control over. And today we're very fortunate. We have quite a team of folks that are going to be with us. In the Edmonds School District, we always like to begin our group gatherings with our land acknowledgement. So if you could read along while I read it aloud. We acknowledge the original inhabitants of this place, the Sadobish people, and their successors, the Tulalip tribes, who since time immemorial have taken care of, hunted, fished, and gathered on these lands. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and we honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. By acknowledging these homelands, we commit to working with tribal nations to further the education aims they have identified in our classrooms and our schools. Thank you. Today, our agenda includes a district ADA audit report. We have some special guests who have conducted that audit report and have some really important information, really compelling information for us to interact with today. Then we're going to open things up to a panel discussion, and then we will finish with a Q&A from our audience. And that'll be your opportunity, those of you that have joined the webinar, to add questions to the chat, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can. We're not going to do an extensive introduction right now of our panelists, but Carrie, our facilitator, is going to put a document into the chat that will have a more extensive bio on each of our panelists. But I do want to welcome Joyce Wheeler, and Shelton Ensley, and Kay Wheeler, who are with Pacifica Group. We also have some special guests, Kevin Berg, Julie Grant, and Anita Erskine, who you will get to see in just a little bit. I do also want to acknowledge a couple of important people before we finish things up. The steering committee that's behind this includes Eliza Smith, Heidi Brislin, Michelle Lorette, and Tane Wilton. And we also have a lot of communications and technical support on the back end. And those include Carrie McGee, our administrative assistant, and Amanda and Curtis on our communications team. So big thanks to them. All right. So I am going to stop sharing, and we are going to turn things over to Joyce and to Shelton to lead us in our first section.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. As mentioned, we are with Studio Pacifica, an accessibility consulting firm based in Seattle. We work on a wide variety of projects in the Pacific Northwest and across the US, with extensive experience working on education projects from preschool to university. I'm Shelton Ensley, an accessibility specialist with Studio Pacifica and a licensed architect. My colleague Joyce and I were the staff members who worked with HKP on the survey of some schools of the Edmonds School District.
I'm Joyce Wheeler. I'm the project manager and accessibility specialist at Studio Pacifica. And both of my kids went to school in the Edmonds School District at the old Madrona K-8 and Mount Lake Terrace High School. My oldest is a power wheelchair user. And so I have a little insight about some of the barriers we faced in those schools in particular. I've also done a lot of volunteer work in the district, and I worked as a paraeducator in both learning support and life skills departments in the district. So I was thrilled when HKP asked us to join them in their assessment and the district's ongoing effort to improve accessibility and inclusion in their schools. We at Studio Pacifica really have a soft spot for educational projects because we believe everyone has the right to live a barrier-free life and have full access to an education. Often preschool or kindergarten is where many children with disabilities face their first big barriers in society. After all, it's challenging to focus on learning if you're worried about how you're going to navigate the school or access the bathroom. But it's also important to remember that it's not just the students we're concerned with. Teachers, paraeducators, parents, grandparents, janitors, therapists, coaches, administrators, staff, all enter educational facilities on a daily or occasional basis and should all feel welcomed and included.
Our goal today is not to just talk about the work we did with HKP in the district, but it's also to shift your thinking. We are hoping that you will learn some things today that will help you be a strong advocate in your school and in your communities. It is important to remember the ADA largely protects people with mobility impairments. But in order to achieve a truly welcoming and inclusive environment, we must also keep in mind the needs of people in the neurodivergent community and those who have sensory-based disabilities. People who access schools in the district may have permanent or temporary disabilities. Perhaps even you will need some of these accessible features at some point.
You will hear the word barrier used a lot throughout our work. The American with Disabilities Act defines a barrier as an organizational, facility, program, service, policy, practice, or equipment that limits or denies equal access opportunities for a person with a disability. An environmental barrier restricts personal movement, activity, and/or hampers safety and might include stairs, dim lighting, noise, narrow aisles, doors with tall thresholds or heavy closers, and even communication features. In summary, an environmental barrier is anything that keeps a person from accessing and using the facility. The ADA also makes a definition for barrier removal, and the removal of barriers should be readily achievable. Readily achievable means that the barrier removal can be accomplished without much difficulty or expense.
The 2010 Americans with Disabilities Act is federal civil rights legislation that sets minimum requirements, both scoping in terms of what needs to be done and technical how to do it, for newly designed and constructed or altered state and local government facilities, public accommodations, and commercial facilities to be readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. It also states that entities are required to remove these barriers in existing facilities if doing so is readily achievable. There are 5 sections of the ADA called titles. Public schools fall under Title II of the ADA, which covers state and local government facilities. The Department of Justice, the DOJ, is the governing authority for the ADA and has set the following priorities for barrier removal. Priority 1, accessible approach and entrance. You have to get to the door and be able to get through it. Priority 2, access to goods and services. In schools, that would be classrooms, offices, theaters, gymnasiums. Priority 3, access to restrooms. Priority 4, any other measures necessary, like drinking fountains. It's one thing to make things temporarily accessible or to make an accommodation for one person's specific needs. But true inclusivity means not having to ask for access or accommodation. It's about having spaces that are inviting and welcoming to all.
We thought it might be helpful to give you an overview of some common terms used in the ADA and some of the basic requirements. And it's important to note that the ADA is a set of federal standards that applies to public spaces and accommodations, but buildings must also comply with the accessibility portion of the building code under which it was permitted. That section is called the A117.1. The current version of the A117.1 is 2009, and the standards in there align with the ADA on most things. There is a new version coming out that will finally exceed the ADA requirements, but that will only apply to new construction that's permitted under the new code. Clear floor space is a term that describes how much space a wheelchair takes up. The current code in the ADA says that's 30 by 48 inches. The new code increases that to 30 by 52.
Turning space is the space required for a wheelchair to turn around and is required in every room. The 2009 A117.1 requires a 60-inch turning circle or a compliant T-turn. The upcoming 217 code has increased those requirements to 67 inches for the turning circle and provides 3 different options for a T-turn.
Knee and toe space is the space required for a wheelchair to roll under a countertop or a work surface.
There are several requirements for a reach range depending on the orientation, whether a side reach or a forward reach, and whether there is an obstruction between the user and the element. Note that the farther you are away from something, the lower your reach range is.
There are several different options for door maneuvering clearance, depending on the approach to the door, whether you're on the push side or the pull side, whether the door has a closer or an automatic opener.
People who use a white cane for navigation use walls to orient themselves within a space. Because of this, elements that protrude can be hazards. Elements may not protrude greater than 4 inches if they're located between 27 and 80 inches above the floor. If they do protrude more than 4 inches, then a cane detectable barrier is required below 27 inches.
Wayfinding is a term that's used to describe how a person navigates and orients themselves in a space or environment. In our work, we use it specifically to address those in the low vision and blindness community. Some of the elements included in this area could be, signs, braille, tactile materials, and contrast.
Of the 33 schools in the district, 15 were built or remodeled before the adoption of the ADA in 1991. 13 were built or remodeled between 1991 and the 2010 updated version of the ADA. 5 were built or remodeled after the 2010 edition of the ADA. We surveyed 4 school sites. Beverly Elementary, originally built in 1959 and remodeled in 1988. Martha Lake Elementary, built in 1953 and remodeled in 1993. Maplewood K-8 Cooperative, built in 2002, and Mount Lake Terrace High School, built in 1991.
As we observed the conditions of each element on each campus, we noticed there were several trends of non-conforming items. At the top of the list was the single and multi-user restrooms. Most restrooms required further design work in order to bring them into compliance. Most of the single user rooms didn't even have a footprint big enough to allow for compliance. They did not have turning space within the room. There was not enough room for a wheelchair user to transfer onto the toilet. Several of the items were out of reach range. Some didn't have an accessible compartment. Some had accommodations made for previous students that were no longer needed. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the restroom department.
Many doors lacked maneuvering clearance on at least one side of the door, either due to the architecture with walls being in the way, or objects such as furniture being placed in the way. Many doors did not provide a compliant clear opening width.
Most of the sinks in and outside of the classroom had cabinetry underneath that prevented forward approach, and many weren't mounted at a compliant height. The bubblers or drinking fountains that were mounted on the sinks in the classrooms were mounted way too far back and couldn't be accessed because of lack of knee and toe clearance for forward approach.
Most drinking fountains were found to not be compliant. Many drinking fountains outside of classrooms were not compliant due to a lack of clear floor space for a forward approach, or being a single fountain installed where two are required, one for standing height and one at seated height.
Work surface and service counters were not compliant. They were either not at the right height, or they did not provide a portion with a compliant knee and toe clearance or a wheelchair to roll underneath them.
Many elements were mounted out of reach range. Unobstructed reach range is 15 inches to 48 inches. If there is an obstruction, the reach range requirements change. Frequently noted items included phones, paper towel, seat cover and soap dispensers, hooks, shelving, and vending machine controls.
We found many protruding objects in and outside of the classrooms. In some cases, these items can be removed or relocated. In others, they'll need a fixed cane detectable barrier underneath them.
All schools had some elements of parking, signage, and or accessible loading zones that were not compliant. The signs were not mounted at the correct height, or in one case, the stalls were located so that anyone getting in and out of a van, typically by a ramp on the passenger side, would be directly in the vehicular way.
Several instances were found where the exterior walkway surfaces and accessible routes had slopes that were beyond the maximum allowed. Pavers and expansion joints and grates within the path had openings greater than a ½ inch, which are a safety concern. Anybody in a mobility device or using a cane. Thresholds and aging concrete created changes in level that weren't compliant. And in some cases, accessible routes were lacking, or they were not well marked. For instance, the Mount Lake Terrace High School Theater, the main entrance is stairs, and there is an accessible route that goes around the back through band hall through a side door to get in, but that is not well marked anywhere. Anybody that didn't know the school would not be aware of that route.
Change takes time, but it's important to have a plan. The ADA mandates that every school district must have a transition plan outlining existing barriers and a plan for removing them. School districts rely on budgeted funds, so the plan could stretch over several years and change depending on budgets. New construction and alterations also require design work that takes time to implement.
The good news is there are many things that can be removed from that list fairly easily and inexpensively. And temporary accommodations may be necessary until the barriers can be removed or buildings can be altered or rebuilt to bring them into full compliance. Here's some things that you can consider.
Anything that projects more than 4 inches and is located between 27 and 80 inches from the floor is a hazard to those with low vision or blindness. Most can be relocated, or a barrier can be provided below 27 inches that can be detected by someone using a white cane. Common objects we saw were drinking fountains, monitors and screens, fire extinguishers, AED boxes, pencil sharpeners, wall-mounted mailboxes, paper towel dispensers, mechanical equipment, and hand sanitizer dispensers. Unobstructed reach range is between 15 inches and 48 inches above the floor. The ranges change once you have to reach over something, such as a cabinet. If something is out of reach range and you can't relocate it, often you can add another device, receptacle, dispenser within reach range to compensate. Common objects we saw out of reach range were receptacles and switches, paper towel dispensers, toilet seat dispensers, and wall-mounted phones.
Watch for obstructions in the door maneuvering clearance, in the clear floor space, or turning space. In schools, it's really common to see furniture and trash receptacles within those spaces that block access to the elements. We see this particularly in the door maneuvering clearance because teachers are trying to maximize the storage space in the room. And also check your door opening force. The maximum allowable is 5 pounds of pressure. And even that's too much for a lot of people. So invest in a good door pressure gauge and have your maintenance staff check it regularly.
As mentioned earlier, the ADA mostly addresses mobility requirements, but there are other things to consider in making spaces inclusive, welcoming, and usable by people of all abilities. For people in the low vision blindness community, consider wayfinding, beyond signage, tactile materials, and braille, contrast of vision of value and contrast of color, protruding objects, wall surfaces, and floor surfaces. For people in the deaf and hard of hearing community, consider visual cues, clear sight path to interpreters, and technology. For people in the neurodiverse community, consider lighting, noise levels, and decompression spaces.
Remember, it's important to listen to your students and staff for input on what's working and what's not working. This is valuable information that you can use to accommodate your direct community. Be mindful of access conflicts, where solving one issue might cause a new one to arise. For instance, in the deaf and hard of hearing community, often flashing lights are used as alerts, which may be triggering to someone in the neurodiverse community. That's why communication is so important, so to come up with solutions that work for everybody. And when changes can't be made easily or cost effectively, sometimes the only option is to make an accommodation for someone until the barrier can be permanently removed. This can include moving a class to a more accessible classroom, modifying a restroom to the best it can be, even if it's not fully compliant, adding an automatic door opener, and ask the people involved what they need. People with disabilities are very good at adapting their environment and also always have low, easy remedies to the situation where other people might think it's something that needs to be expensive or costly. And then make your accessibility features known. If you only have certain restrooms that are accessible or a non-direct accessible route, make sure you make that information known via your website, some signage. Someone visiting the school might not be aware of that. Also make sure that routes to accessible spaces don't have locked doors that are a barrier, especially if those facilities are being used after hours.
If you want to learn more, here are some great resources. The U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. For answers to common questions to official legal documents, ada.gov has everything you need to understand your rights and responsibilities under the ADA. The Access Board is an independent federal agency that promotes equality for people with disabilities through leadership in accessible design and the development of accessibility guidelines and standards. They also provide guidelines and animations to better help explain some of these standards.
Thank you for the opportunity to present our findings to you today. and to the district and the Disability Advisory Council for your strategic vision of being welcoming to all.
Right. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Shelton, so much for preparing those slides and sharing that information with us. This audit was initiated by our capital projects team. And as you saw, Tane Wilton, who is the director of capital projects, has been a member of our steering committee since the beginning. And as was mentioned, it's about now that we know what are we going to do about it. And we're not going to engage with Tane today, but I can assure you that the plan that they're working on is extensive. It's forward thinking and quite expensive, but we're not seeing that as a barrier. There are things that we know that we need to do and have needed to do for a long time. So thank you again. We're going to transition now to the second part of our webinar today, and that is a panel discussion. So I'll invite the rest of our guests to join us. And we have a series of questions for you, but before we dive into those questions, I'd love for our audience to know who you are and the perspective that you bring to this conversation. So if you wouldn't mind starting for us, Kay, we'd love to hear from you first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kay Wheeler. I use they, them pronouns. I am the marketing coordinator for Studio Pacifica. I am also a power wheelchair user, and I attended Edmond School District schools for my K through 12 education, starting at Madrona K through 8, and then moving to Mount Lake Terrace High School.
So thanks so much for being here today. Next up, can we hear from Kevin? Welcome.
I'm Kevin Bird. I grew up in the Seattle area as a power wheelchair user. My mom was a big advocate for accessibility, so I know quite a bit about it. And now I live in Waikiki as a disability educator.
Thank you for being here, Kevin. Next up, Anita.
Hello, I'm Anita. I am currently a kindergarten teacher at an independent school. I have been a manual wheelchair user nearly all of my life. I went through K8 or K-12 education, using a manual wheelchair and experiencing the environment. And I also have a mother that is very involved in disability advocacy.
Thank you for joining us, Anita. And next up, Julie.
Hello, I am Julie Grant, and I'm an occupational therapist at the Lake Washington School District, and I have been a manual wheelchair user for 27 years, so quite a long time. And I wasn't disabled until college, so it was a little later than some of the others.
Great, thank you for being here, Julie.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a series of questions that our team put together, and I'll ask those. If you wanted to respond to that, I think that we're a small enough group that we can jump in and take turns. With that, we'll go ahead and start with our first question, which is, if money was no barrier, what is one type of environmental barrier that you most want to remove in public spaces?
Stairs, just overall, just everything level entry would be fantastic. It would also eliminate the need for like bottlenecking at elevators and stuff. It'd be great if just everything was flat.
For
me, it would be curb cuts. People are always in the way of the curb cut. People don't understand that the curb cuts are for disabilities. I'd rather have the street and sidewalk at the same level or something like that.
For me, I would also agree that it's stairs. But instead of, I'm less determined to have a flat environment, unlike Kay, and more interested in just having a lot more ramp access. I think that gives more freedom to environments such as schools that do need multiple levels, or like I think about my gymnasium and every time that I couldn't go on the stage because that was stairs, but if there were a ramp, there would have been a way to participate with my class.
Do you have anything to add, Julie, before we move on?
I agree with Anita. Yeah, it's definitely, I think I just know that realistically, like we just don't have enough land to be totally flat. So at least, but you know, appropriate ramps, not super steep, terrible ramps.
Sure, for sure. Our next question was thinking about supporting our school staff and giving them some pointers on how they could best arrange their offices and their classrooms to make them more accessible.
Ooh, I love this one. I am a wheelchair user, and I find that in my classroom, one of the hardest things is figuring out spacing between my students' desk tables and their chairs, and just trying to get around so that I can access and help every student. That was also one of my biggest problems as a kid, was like I couldn't go visit my friend's desk. Um, and so one of the biggest things that I have tried to teach my school community is that teachers should try and roll around their classroom using their office chair and see if they can fit that between the spaces between desks and chairs, to see if there's enough room realistically around the furniture that they're setting up. I also strongly encourage the use of lightweight chairs, because those can be easier for people with disabilities to either push with their wheelchair or pick up to move out of their way.
I love those ideas, Anita. I think that's great. Yeah, as a OT, I access 20 different classrooms every day, just about. And what I see is that it's funny, it's things that Joyce mentioned, like the under sink space is always has a garbage can there. It usually has a step stool, and it might have the evacuation toilet bucket as well. And so all these lovely sinks, and I want to wash my hands and I can't, or I want to help rinse out paint or something along those lines. I've also found that tables are better than desks, and I'm not sure why. There's just like a little more room in the rooms that have tables. And some of those rooms have more students than the rooms that have desks, but I think maybe it's less legs. I'm not sure, but it's just a lot easier to get around in the spaces with tables.
Yeah, I could agree with that. The other thing, Julie, that your comment made me think about was the stuff that's under the desk. Like in every other classroom, that's a problem in my school too. And I have tried to counteract it by putting a lot of things on rolling carts. Because there are times I can push it under the sink, and then there are other times that I need to get under the sink. And so that's one other idea, to put things where you can move them easily.
I would add along those lines, places to store things that aren't in the pathway. Like if students are keen to throw their backpacks and jackets directly in the walk and rolling path that you very nicely set up by rolling your office chair around, doesn't matter if the space is there, if everyone's throwing their jackets in the middle of it, and watching what you put behind doors, especially doors that swing into a classroom, or tight space. If there's stuff behind the door, it means the door won't open all of the way, and then we're not getting advantage of the full clear opening space, let alone space to actually open the door and fit through if it's not a door that stays open by itself.
All right. The next question is, you've hit on this, but there's a little bit more to what we're asking here. So in thinking about your experience as a wheelchair user in a school, what are ways that the built environment most hindered your access and participation to your education, that actually impacted your learning? whether that be academic or social emotional or extracurricular.
I could add, for me, because I was injured right as I started college, and so I went home for a year and then came back. Most of the time, there would be one table in the whole room that I could sit in. And sometimes, depending on the size of the lecture hall, that might be on the lower level, right by the teacher, and no one would sit down there. And I would have to go in a different door, and I would have to find that door because it wasn't the main door to the building. Other times, it was all the way in the back. And that really limited the other students I could interact with. Most of the time, this was lectures, so it wasn't tons of interaction time, but it was isolating. I mean, it limited who I got to sit by. It also led to lots of awkward interactions because there was only one table. And so if someone decided they needed to sit at it, I would have to figure out how to politely get them out of the space that I needed. It's bad when you have a spinal cord injury to sit on a hard seat, but I was shy and adjusting to my disability. So sometimes I would transfer onto a hard wooden seat just because it was my only other option besides having a confrontation with someone. And then even in grad school, in the lecture halls at the University of Washington Medical Center, there were often no accessible seats. They didn't have a table. At one point, the PT department head was dragging a table down the extremely long hallway so that I would have a table because they just somehow it was too much bureaucracy to get a table. And it affected me a lot. It's just like kind of, people talk about microaggressions, and it's kind of that, like it eats away at you every day. It's like, oh, do I belong here? I don't even have a place to sit and do my work.
This is gonna sound a little weird, but one quarter in college, they were trying to be helpful and put all of my classes in the same room. The problem was I would get so bored of that room, I would end up falling asleep or not learning. There are times that you can overcompensate, and it's not helpful.
I would say the route between locations often for me took longer than the non-wheelchair using student body because there would often be like one accessible restroom per building or per floor versus the variety of different restrooms that other people would have access to, or one of the entrances to a building would be accessible, but not all of the entrances to a building. So I'm thinking specifically my time at Mount Lake Terrace High School, the like main front door was accessible. And there was a weird side door on the ground floor that was accessible. But if I had to get from the corner of one wing to the ground floor of even the same side of that V, I would have to go all the way to the central area to take the elevator to go down and then go back, where a lot of my fellow classmates could take that end of corridor stair set down. So it was a quick jump for them down versus I would have to go all the way back and forth. And if there were other people who also needed the elevator during that same passing period, we were all fighting for who could get to the elevator first to get there fastest. And I had accommodation to let me leave classes early and show up late without the same penalty of tardiness that other students would get, but I was still then shaving off 5 to 10 minutes from every single class period, potentially, depending on how far I needed to go. And one of the only two accessible restrooms I could use was actually within the locker room. So when there was a class going and they locked the locker room to keep people from going in that weren't in the class and stealing things, it meant there was no accessible restroom on that floor anymore. So I had to add elevator time to bathroom time, which lengthened the amount of time I was out of the class.
Great. Are you gonna jump in, Anita?
Yes, I would say for me, some of the biggest things that I personally think about in like my ideal situation, I work in a much smaller school than probably most of your schools are, but the concept of if the whole class can take the accessible route, if there's not an elevator involved and it just means that we all walk a little bit longer, I firmly believe that teachers should be choosing that option, because as much as we tell our kids in our classes that when we're walking in line, your voice is off, we all also know that that is still a social opportunity and that kids are learning their social skills in those moments. And so to ask a kid or just to go solo with a teacher or with one other friend is still not the same as saying, well, we can actually all walk this together. And so we should just account for that little bit of extra time.
Mhm.
And I wanted to add, because Kay was talking about their accommodation to leave early and arrive late. And that I mean, I write accommodations constantly, but I've avoided that one because it makes me anxious personally, like knowing that you're missing the last 5 minutes of your class. And when they're like, oh yeah, don't forget your homework is blah, blah, blah. And I just think there's so many missed things. And then the little bit of chatter that happens as you move between classes and whatnot, and you're missing out on that. And it's really important. And I had kind of a similar experience in one of my I went to grad school twice. And the first one, I had to use the freight elevator in the back of the building. So, and everyone else got to go down this beautiful ornamental staircase, and they would have social plans. And by the time I got to the front of the building, everyone would be gone. And even as an adult in grad school, that still just crushes your heart. Yeah.
Well, we'll have one more question from our list, and then we will open it up to our webinar guests. So this is perhaps taking some of you back a little bit, but can you speak to some of the unique challenges you faced in specialty classrooms, like our science labs, art rooms, or other specialized learning environments? And how could those be improved? What are some things that educators that are responsible for those spaces should and could be thinking about?
This
I-
makes me, sorry, were you jumping in? Okay, this makes me think of when I was in high school and I had an art teacher and they had raised tables in there and they also insisted that everybody sit on these raised stools. And so the only choice to participate in art was either transfer to this stool where I was definitely at risk of falling off, or to try and draw at a table that was at the height of my nose. And so, and I never found the accommodation for that. It was just oh, that's too bad, Anita. And man, we should do that better someday. And so thinking about I think for me it goes back to the seating choices and the way that you're designing your type of lab classrooms, and are stools important, and do you have tables that are at a reasonable height? Because what's the need for a raised height stool when you could really just have lowered all of your counters or chairs in the first place?
I have simultaneously had some of my best school experiences in specialty classrooms and some of my worst experiences in specialty classrooms. And I think the main deciding factor really comes down to the attitude of the teacher and greater learning environment. Teachers and support aides that are willing to come up with adaptive solutions and aren't so stuck in, well, that's how we do it and that's how we've always do it or have always done it. I have had sometimes it takes some time because it's new, just as new to them as it is to me in this specific situation, but their willingness to listen to my firsthand lived experience and what I say are my limits and needs, and then meet me in the middle to try to figure out solutions to things. I actually completely rearranged my elective plans going into high school because of a teacher that I saw during the electives fair going in at Terrace that I was really interested in the little demo that they were giving. And right away, I was like, I'm interested, but I don't see how I would do this class. And from step one, he's like, I don't know, but if you're interested, we can figure it out. And I think that's the best way to go about it. It probably also helped that we were a STEM magnet school, so we had some engineering teachers at the school that could help, and some tools and machines that could help make things if that was something that was needed. And personally, my father is a machinist, so we also had access to those kind of things at home. But just going in with that mindset is really makes a world of difference, even if you're stuck using the same built environment at the get-go.
One of the biggest mistake a teacher can make is to go easy on a student with a disability, because the environment isn't as accessible. A lot of teachers don't take the time to figure out what to do. They, at least when I was in school, I had a teacher that was going, I had a lot of teachers that were going too easy on me. The ones I remember the most are the ones that challenged me. And helped me find accessible ways of doing things.
Well, thank you. Now we're going to invite our guests to drop their questions in the chat, and I'll introduce Elisa to join us. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so far we don't have any questions, so feel free to start dropping them in the chat, or else we can keep going with the questions that we had for the panelists.
Give a sec to see what comes in. Well, I'll go ahead and continue. One of the questions we had, and we know that a lot of focus has been on accessible playgrounds, and you know, you each have a really great perspective, I think, to answer this question. So how could we think about playgrounds, our gymnasiums, and other outdoor spaces to better accommodate students with physical disabilities more effectively? You know, we have spaces where things have been certainly done, but I don't know that we always have the much evidence that shows that they really are being accessed by all students. And Carrie, it looks like the chat's disabled, so that would explain it.
I think one of the biggest things is choice to the amount that's possible. Choices of different playground like equipment kind of stuff. If most of what your playground area is just like swing sets and slides, that's not going to be a great environment for people who use mobility devices that don't have the option to transfer or get on those devices. They're just going to be watching their friends participate. But if they have other things that can be interact with, like tetherball or other things that don't require you to physically transfer onto a thing, or I've seen some schools put in special like wheelchair specifically minded playground equipment, but sometimes those things require a additional person to utilize them, and they can't be done by a child themselves. And usually that additional person has to be an adult. So especially if there's short staffing at recess, that's cool, that great that you have that piece of equipment, but if it can't actually be used, that's not really super helpful. terrain choice is also really important, especially in an area like Edmonds that gets a lot of rain. If you have just like dirt fields, it's gonna be messy, especially for anyone that has to physically touch their tires to move forward. Like at least me as a power chair user, my hand didn't have to get all up in that mud if I was in my chair going through it. But it's still not nice to go through and then you're tracking mud everywhere. I can't take my tires off at the door like someone could take muddy boots off. Um, Wood chips are not super easy to roll through, slightly easier with a power chair than a manual chair from what I've observed, but feel free, those of you that actually use manual chairs, to argue with me on that point. I really like that like rubbery little pellets that are, they're not like loose, but they're not hard. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but that was a great texture and it's soft enough that it is cushioning impact like wood chips is hypothetically doing, but without the chance of getting a huge splinter at the same time. Um, Grass can be rough, not only for just trying to keep it level and weather issues, but a lot of people are allergic to grass, and having a lot of running around, rolling around in grass can also be rough too. But if you have multiple different options for different places that children can play, then they can choose the areas that work for them. And hopefully it's not like this is the weird side accessible place, and then this is the general education playground, because that's just segregation.
Okay, it looks like we have questions coming in the Q&A part of Zoom instead of the chat. And the first question from Mary is, how can we get automatic door opening systems installed at older buildings?
In my experience, because when I first came to my school district, I was in a new building and an old building, and the old building did have a power button on one door that broke probably bi-weekly. And then every other door was way exceeding the limit. And I talked to my boss and he was like, oh, we'll just switch you to a different school. And I liked my coworkers and I didn't want to do that. So I talked to them about it and they put in a work order. The principal had to put the work order in and get a new power system installed so that it would actually work. And then she also just paid for someone to come and adjust all the door force settings on all the other doors to make it easier, which was really amazing to me because my other building, they had a few doors that were too heavy, even though they were new, and they were kind of like, sorry, ask someone for help. So, which is, and that's one thing I wanted to share just as an employee, because I am technically itinerant. Like my home office is technically in the resource center and I could be assigned to any building. And it's terrifying because depending on how big my caseload is, they might want to move me to another building. And in the office that I'm in now, I'm lucky enough my caseload allows me to just be here, but that could change at any point in time and I could go somewhere else. Where one example I have is the whole building didn't have an accessible adult women's bathroom. And any of the staff workspaces, there weren't desks that I could get under. And I'm like pretty standard size manual chair user. Like it's not extreme any of my needs. And the fact that there was just like nothing that would work, they just like reassign me. And that is hard. I really like to be a collaborative employee. And so it's kind of scary, like the thought that, oh, my job could just get a lot harder any moment because I had too low of a caseload or whatever. And yeah, it brings up a lot of ethical issues in my mind.
Mhm.
I know as a student, we had to actively ask for them as part of my accommodations, and then they were only slowly added to the specific building I was in when I requested it. So then as I moved along into different classrooms that were in different buildings, they would add just one to then that building when I needed it, then one to that building when I needed it. And all of them weren't just common buttons that anyone could push. I had a separate like remote too, which then made it a very me only accommodation. It was not a accommodation that then provided better access for anyone who might need that feature. I don't know if that's still how they're running things now, but when I graduated in 2014, that was still how they were doing it.
Another question is, for the design of a new school, what would be the most important aspects where we should try to exceed the ADA requirements?
I'll chime in on this one because I think the most important thing you can do is listen to your community. You know, if the new school's being built, you pretty much know the community that's going to be attending it. So hold some listening sessions, engage your community, ask what they need, what they want. You'd be amazed how much information will come out of those sessions. And then the other thing is to offer choices. You know, there's no one thing, even in the ADA, that works for everybody. So especially when it comes to, you know, like table heights, seating options, offer a lot of choices so that there'll be something that will likely work for everybody.
I would say restrooms that are the area that they should go over. Says every area is important, but if you have to go to the bathroom, you can't focus on what you're doing and what you're learning.
Along the lines of the bathroom thing, in a separate project that Studio Pacifica worked on, we did a community engagement session and asked different members of the community what they thought was the most important feature, and a lot of them rated bathrooms much higher than the like common practice priority list that Shelton and Joyce went over earlier, with the added note that it's way easier to ask a random other person, in this case, it would be a student, to open a door for you or something like that, but you're not going to ask a friend to help you in the restroom if you can't get in. So that's a definitely more intimate and private area that it's harder and not comfortable to ask for help in the same way. So if those areas are accessible, it just makes a way smoother process. And it's not like you can leave campus to go somewhere else to go to the restroom.
I think the good news is that current building codes and the ADA mandate that bathrooms have to be accessible, and you have to have a certain number of accessible stalls, and you have to have accessible sinks, and you have to have access to classrooms. You have to have access to all of those things. The downside is that that is all focused only on mobility device users. As we said earlier, anything that is focused towards the neurodivergent community is not covered in that. And it's limited for the things that are required for the deaf or hard of hearing community. So those would be the areas that we would, Studio Pacifica, would push to go beyond, to really learn what those kinds of things are, and talk to the community and find out what's going to work best for everyone.
Let's see if we can get one more question in.
One question which might be hard for well, actually, I'll just ask it. There was a question as to, given the survey, what's the timeline for the district in responding to the accessibility issues that came up with this survey?
Well, it's hard to speak with authority on that. What I can say is that Tane and her team Tane Wilton, our director of capital projects, is closely working with her team and with our maintenance team to address these issues. The next step after the audit was to assess and prioritize what those things needed to be done first, and really following the model that Shelton and Joyce spoke to, which is kind of you know, stepping it out in terms of what are your things that you can address immediately. What are those things that are longer term and take a little more capital? You know, what are those things? I think I would add to this is what pose an immediate and imminent risk or danger to, you know, members of a community that are experiencing disabilities. So there's definitely a plan. It's also a huge part of our design for our new buildings and for any remodel projects that we have. So there's a lot going on in there, and I think it's probably a really good follow-up with our capital projects team to see if we can get some communication out that speaks more specifically to what the plan is moving forward. So we're not just leaving those questions hanging out there. So we are at time, and I am known for honoring time. We start on time, we end on time as best as we can. I do want to close by saying big thank you to all of our panelists. I truly understand how it is to have a commitment at the end of a long workday, and just know that that means so much to us, that you were willing to take time gratis to join us. We so appreciate that. And for our guests that joined the webinar, thank you so much for coming to learn from these amazing people. And just a couple of things. One is we will share the recorded webinar with our community. There'll be some time limits on that. We're not going to post it forever and ever, but we have a course available for our staff to take to earn continuing ed credits. It'll be linked there, and we'll also link the video in a follow-up communication that we provide to our community. So if you've attended today and you know you had friends or colleagues that weren't able to attend but wanted to hear the information, know that that's a great way that we'll be able to share all that we learned today. So with that,
I have one more thing to add. I was going to drop a link in the chat or Q&A for OTs and PTs if you want to take a quiz to get a continuing education certificate, but I don't see a way to do that. So I'll add that for the Canvas link, and once we get a link to the recording, I can also send out the link to the quiz to people, or you can reach out to me directly.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, sorry.
A little bit different requirements for our different groups. Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening. Looking out, it's already very dark. So if you have a little bit of travel in front of you, do so safely and enjoy your evening. Thank you again.